We will see how reading goes today. Here's my very beat up version of The Hobbit now, all thanks to Ginger. Ginger, who is a mutt of sorts, but anyways. So, thank you, Ginger. We are halfway through, and I will soon have to get another copy of The Hobbit. I wanted to find this copy. It's the Ballantine, because I have another set of 4 books. I'm also battling a cold. So, when we left off, I was on page 178, and the wood elves were singing about throwing the barrels of whatever supplies they needed into the dark water. Bilbo realized that he didn't have his own barrel, and the ring doesn't really help him with that. So, the barrels have all been thrown into the water, and Bilbo's just kind of churning along with them. So out they went under the overhanging branches of the trees on either bank. Bilbo wondered what the dwarves were feeling, and whether a lot of water was getting into their tubs. Some of those that bobbed along by him in the gloom seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed that these had dwarves inside. I do hope I put the lids on tight enough, he thought, but before long he was worrying too much about himself to remember the dwarves. He managed to keep his head above the water, but he was shivering with the cold, and he wondered if he would die of it before the luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim to the bank. The luck turned all right before long. The eddying current carried several barrels close ashore at one point, and there for a while they struck against some hidden root. Then Bilbo took the opportunity of scrambling up the side of his barrel while it was held steady against another. Up he crawled like a drowning rat, and lay on the top spread out to keep the balance as best he could. The breeze was cold but better than the water, and he hoped he would not suddenly roll off again when they started off once more. Before long the barrels broke free again and turned and twisted off down the stream and out into the main current. Then he found it quite as difficult to stick on as he had feared, but he managed it somehow, though it was miserably uncomfortable. Luckily, he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one, and being rather leaky, had now shipped a small amount of water. All the same, it was like trying to ride, without bridle or stirrups, a round-bellied pony that was always thinking of rolling on the grass. In this way, at last, Mr. Baggins came to a place where the trees on either hand grew thinner. He could see the paler sky between them. The dark river opened suddenly wide, and there it was joined to the main water of the forest river, flowing down in haste from the king's great doors. There was a dim sheet of water no longer overshadowed, and on its sliding surface there were dancing and broken reflections of clouds and of stars. Then the hurrying water of the forest river swept all the company of casks and tubs away to the north bank, in which it had eaten out a wide bay. This had a shingly shore under hanging banks, and was walled at the eastern end by a little jutting cape of hard rock. On the shallow shore, most of the barrels ran aground, although a few went on to bump against the stony pier. There were people on the lookout on the banks. They quickly pulled and pushed all the barrels together into the shallows, and when they had counted them, they roped them together and left them till the morning. Poor dwarves. Bilbo was not so badly off now. He slipped from his barrel and waded ashore, and then sneaked along to some huts that he could see near the water's edge. He no longer thought twice about picking up a supper uninvited. if he got the chance. He had been obliged to do it for so long, and he knew only too well what it was to be really hungry, not merely politely interested in the dainties of a well-filled larder. Also, he had caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees, and that appealed to him with his dripping and ragged clothes clinging to him cold and clammy. So I'm on top of page 181. Definitely got the congestion going. There is no need to tell you much of his adventures that night, for now we are drawing near the end of the eastward journey and coming to the last and greatest adventure. So we must hurry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, he got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and the trail of drippings that he left wherever he went or sat, and also he began to snivel. How appropriate. Cold coming on, Bilbo is cold. And wherever he tried to hide, he was found out by the terrific explosions of his suppressed sneezes. Very soon, there was a fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped into the woods, carrying a loaf and a leather bottle of wine and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had to pass wet, as he was far from a fire, but the bottle helped him to do that, and he actually dozed a little on some dry leaves, even though the year was getting late and the air was chilly. He woke again with a specially loud sneeze. It was already gray morning, and there was a merry racket down by the river. They were making up a raft of barrels, and the raft elves would soon be steering it off down the stream to Lake Town. Bilbo sneezed again. He was no longer dripping, but he felt cold all over. He scrambled down as fast as his stiff legs would take him and managed just in time to get on the mass of casks without being noticed in the general bustle. Remember, he's still wearing the ring, so technically he's invisible to the eyes. Luckily, there was no sun at the time to cast an awkward shadow, and for a mercy he did not sneeze again for a good while. There was a mighty pushing of poles. The elves that were standing in the shallow water heaved and shoved. The barrels, now all lashed together, creaked and fretted. "This is a heavy load," some grumbled. "They float too deep. Some of these are never empty. If they had come ashore in the daylight, we might have had a look inside." They said, "No time now," cried the raftmen. "Shove off." And off they went at last, slowly at first, until they had passed the point of rock where the other elves stood to fend them off with poles, and then quicker and quicker as they caught the main stream and went sailing away down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king and were through the wood, but whether alive or dead still remains to be seen. So now we are on chapter 10, A Warm Welcome. The day grew lighter and warmer as they floated along. After a while, the river rounded a steep shoulder of land that came down upon their left. Under its rocky feet, like an inland cliff, the deepest stream had flowed, lapping and bubbling. Suddenly the cliff fell away, the shores sank, the trees ended. Then Bilbo saw a sight. The lands opened wide about him, filled with the waters of the river, which broke up and wandered in 100 winding courses, or halted in marshes and pools, dotted with isles on every side. But still a strong water flowed on steadily through the mist. And far away, its dark head in a torn cloud, there loomed the mountains. Oh, the mountain. Its nearest neighbors to the northeast and the tumbled land that joined to them could not be seen. All alone it rose and looked across the marshes to the forest. The lonely mountain. Bilbo had come far and through many adventures to see it, and now he did not like the look of it in the least. As he listened to the talk of the raft men and pieced together the scraps of information they let fall, he soon realized that he was very fortunate ever to have seen it at all, even from this distance. Dreary as had been his imprisonment, and unpleasant as was his position, to say nothing of the poor dwarfs underneath him, still he had been more than lucky than he had guessed. The talk was all of the trade that came and went on the waterways, and the growth of the traffic on the river. And as the roads out of the east towards Mirkwood vanished or fell into disuse, and of the bickerings of the lake men and the wood elves about the upkeep of the forest river and the care of the banks. Those lands had changed much since the days when dwarves dwelt in the mountain, days when most people now remembered only as a very shadowy tradition. They had changed even in recent years, and since the last news that Gandalf had of them. Great floods and rains had swollen the waters that flowed east, and there had been an earthquake or two, which some were inclined to attribute to the dragon, alluding to him chiefly with a curse, and with an ominous nod in the direction of the mountain. The marshes and bogs had spread wider and wider on either side. Paths had vanished, and many a rider and wanderer, too, if they tried to find the lost ways across. The elf road through the wood, which the dwarves had followed on the advice of Beorn, now came to a doubtful and little-used end at the eastern edge of the forest. Only the river offered any longer a safe way from the skirts of Mirkwood in the north to the mountain-shadowed plains beyond, and the river was guarded by the wood elves' king. So you see, Bilbo had come to the end by the only road that was any good. It might have been some comfort to Mr. Baggins, shivering on the barrels, if he had known that news of this had reached Gandalf far away and given him great anxiety, and that he was in fact finishing his other business, which does not come into this tale, and getting ready to come in search of Thorin's company. But Bilbo did not know it. All he knew was that the river seemed to go on and on and on forever, and he was hungry and had a nasty cold in the nose, and did not like the way the mountain seemed to frown at him and threaten him as he drew ever nearer. After a while, however, the river took a more southerly course, and the mountain receded again, and at last, late in the day, the shores grew rocky. The river gathered all its wandering waters together into a deep and rapid flood, and they swept along at great speed. The sun had set when, turning with another sweep towards the east, the forest river rushed into the long lake. There it had a wide mouth with stony cliff-like gates at either side, whose feet were piled with shingles. The long lake. Bilbo had never imagined that any water that was not the sea could look so big. It was so wide that the opposite shores looked small and far, but it was so long that its northy end, which pointed towards the mountain, could not be seen at all. Only from the map did Bilbo know that away up there, where the stars of the Wain were already twinkling, the running river came down into that lake from the dale, and with the forest river filled with deep waters, what must once have been a great, deep, rocky valley. At the southern end, the doubled waters poured out again over high waterfalls and ran away hurriedly to unknown lands. In the still evening air, the noise of the falls could be heard like a distant roar. Not far from the mouth of the forest river was the strange town he heard the elves speak of in the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore, though there were a few huts and buildings there, but right out on the surface of the lake, protected from the swirl of the entering river by a promontory of rock, which formed a calm bay. I have to read that again. Not far from the north, from the mouth of the Forest River was the strange town he had heard the elves speak of in the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore, though there were a few huts and buildings there, but right out on the surface of the lake, protected from the swirl of the entering river by a promontory of rock which formed a calm bay. Okay, so they have a town that juts out into the water, but it's kind of protected from the current by this rock that juts out. A great bridge made of wood ran out to where, on huge piles made of forest trees, was built a busy wooden town, not a town of elves, but of men, who still dared to dwell here under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. They still throve, it's throve, Throve, they still throve on the trade that came up from the great river from the south, and was carted past the falls to their town. But in the great days of old, when Dale in the north was rich and prosperous, they had been wealthy and powerful, and there had been fleets of boats on the waters, and some were filled with gold, and some with warriors in armor, and there had been wars and deeds which were now only a legend. The rotting piles of a greater town could still be seen along the shores when the waters sank in a drought. But men remembered little of all that, though some still sang old songs of the dwarf kings of the mountain, Thror and Thrain, and of the race of Durin, and of the coming of the dragon, and the fall of the lords of Dale. Some sang, too, that Thror and Thrain would come back one day, and gold would flow in the rivers through the mountain gates, and all that land would be filled with new song and new laughter. But this pleasant legend did not much affect their daily business. You know, I have recently had a part of my life that just kind of changed drastically, and I wasn't expecting it, but it was kind of an ending of a way of life that I had, and so now's this new beginning of life, and it's scary and a little uncertain. And I remember things that I loved about my old life, but I guess it was time for it to end that way. So I'm kind of in this phase where I'm looking around at the parts of my life that were in a wreck and the parts of my life that are ready for something new to come of it, and the bits and pieces that I get to keep that I learned from my old life. And it kind of reminds me of this town. You can see the wreckage of the old life. You can look distantly back. I can look distantly back to bits and pieces when my kids were much younger. And was it a great time for certain things? Yes. There's always good and bad with everything. Haven't figured out all these thoughts yet, and Bilbo has a cold, so I find it very ironic that Bilbo's going through his cold. I have a cold, and I've come upon this town in a story that is kind of in the middle of being old and decrepit, and with images of former glory. Anyways, haven't figured it all out, but it's a good analysis to use for literature in your life. As soon as the raft of barrels came in sight, boats rowed out from the piles of the town, and voices hailed the raft steerers. Then ropes were cast and oars were pulled, and soon the raft was drawn out of the current of the forest river and towed away round the high shoulder of rock into the little bay of Lake Town. There it was moored, not far from the shoreward head of the great bridge. Soon men would come up from the south and take some of the casks away, and others they would fill with goods they had brought to be taken back up the stream to the wood elves' home. In the meanwhile, The barrels were left afloat, while the elves of the raft and the boatmen went to feast in Lake Town. And as you know, the dwarves are inside, the very dwarves that they were talking about, that are descendants that they were talking about, used to live in the mountain. Thank you for these 20 minutes today. If you have any thoughts, please let me know.